I really like that analogy, Eduardo, because I've always said agility comes from within, and our soul, of course, is within us. That's where agility comes from, not from without, not from the tools, the techniques, the practices that we follow.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eduardo Martins, and this is AgilityTalks. And today I have a special guest. It's Kiron Bondale. Here's your book, Is Interior Difficulty Practice. I believe it's in Amazon for everyone to buy, Kiron.
Absolutely. It's available Amazon, Indigo Chapters, Barnes and Noble in both paperback and ebook formats. It's very reasonably priced. So definitely it's useful for anybody that is in leading initiatives, whether you've been doing it for 30 years or you're just starting. There's probably some lessons in there that will be helpful. And I like to think of it as a field guide.
And it always starts with four of these values. So the Alma Framework that represents the essence of a company. And I'm not sure if you know, Kiron, but Alma is the Portuguese and Spanish word for soul. So the idea is that actually while you apply the framework and the lessons we will learn with you that you share in your book, it can serve as a guide so you can really see the soul of your team.
I really like that analogy, Eduardo, because I've always said agility comes from within, and our soul, of course, is within us. That's where agility comes from, not from without, not from the tools, the techniques, the practices that we follow.
That's what I believe too. So that's great. We are perfectly aligned. So within our soul, I propose us to work in four key agile values. So the first of one is accountability. And the key question for accountability is, do you know what you're accountable for? And for the Alma framework, it actually describes who is perceived as accountable. And what I propose is when you make that question to your team, it starts from the top. So you get answers like no one feels accountable. I feel that only the board feels accountable. The area management feels accountable. Until cascade that down at people level, so through teams leadership and to people level. And the funny thing about accountability is that for me, it's much more than responsibility. It's much more than knowing what to do. It's about owning. It's about ownership. So accountability for me, and accountability for me as a concept in agility, is about ownership. And I know that in your book you might have a bunch of lessons learned based on that. Like just the first one here, like don't procrastinate, escalate, tells me a lot of that.
Absolutely. So when I was looking at this particular value and I was going through my book, I picked these particular three sections or chapters because I felt they all talk to this real concept of ownership. So the first one, don't procrastinate, escalate. Escalation is a powerful tool, which I find that some project managers use too much of it, some use too little of it. There are some project managers that feel they can solve the world's problems and they're going to hang on to that problem until it's well past the point where they can actually make a difference. And they should really escalate to a higher authority. It's the same when we're dealing with an agile team. If we have an agile lead, a scrum master, yes, we expect that they're going to be able to support the team in removing impediments, but they have to recognize when they're outside their sphere of control, and they need to be able to escalate to the appropriate power and influence that power or that authority to be able to take ownership of a problem and resolve it.
I certainly agree, and it's interesting that you brought that up. Like a lot of the companies that I work with and that come to me for advice, they are in that middle ground where they had a little team and they want to escalate, right? And it's funny that regardless the size of the teams of the companies, they always have problems with escalation. They always like I've seen like teams that were little and needed to start, so they will still like stick to that concept that I own these, and and sometimes it's about the founders that do not want to let the cheese go, right? But I've also seen like some mid-size or big-size companies that have problems in structuring the escalation path, and I believe escalation path is something that is very simple but very underestimated within the companies, because when you make the rules the rules of the game clears, the rules of engagement clear, is where you get value out of that, right?
Absolutely, and it's a great way that you stated that making the rules of engagement explicit. So Kanban, for example, talks about making your policies and your processes explicit. This is another example of that. Escalation, I think, has a bad connotation. It comes across as a bad word in some companies.
Exactly.
But if at the beginning of a project or at the beginning of a release, if we say, what are the circumstances under which it's reasonable for the team to escalate an issue or a blocker to a higher power, then everyone is working from the same set of rules. There isn't that perception that escalation is a bad thing or that the person is trying to just finger point that way. We're all going into it eyes open.
Exactly. And transparency is also one of the key things for agility, right? So even if we talk about the values that we propose, when we talk about accountability itself, if you do not know exactly what's your piece within the engine, right? What you really own within that engine, and giving that transparency through, like you'll not be able to really live agile because you hit a limit where you really do not know uh, what the part that you want because it's not clear to everyone. And
Right.
here's where the conflicts comes, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then the second article that I felt resonated with this theme or this value was the 5 signs of a self-managing team. Well, we all know that in Agile, we encourage the development of self-managing teams. And a part of that, though, is accountability. But the
Exactly.
accountability of a self-managing team comes from within, not from without. So it's not the negative aspect of accountability, which is, oh, if this team doesn't do a good job, I'm going to hold them accountable, which means that I get to punish them.
Finger pointing, right? Exactly. That's not what we're talking about here.
That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a team that collectively feels a sense of ownership for the work they're doing, both in terms of the value they're delivering to their customers, but also the quality of that work itself. It's that accountability towards also the transparency to maybe making sure that they're not doing any hidden work. What they're doing is visible to stakeholders, that they're not cutting corners, that they're aligning with enterprise policies and standards. Those are all aspects of accountability that we want to see from a self-managing team. Because when we think about self-managing teams, especially in organizations that are moving towards agility, it's a very challenging situation because the companies, the leadership are somewhat hesitant about granting that degree of power and empowerment to the teams. And so if the teams don't demonstrate accountability, they're going to take away that ability to self-manage.
And it's exactly the other way around, right, Kiron? And when I can like illustrate an example like that, like uh, I had some CTO one time asking me like, how can like I give trust because accountability comes with trust, right? And we will see like further down when we discuss autonomy that uh, you really need to, it's a daily exercise and you need to build that trust, that bond with little pieces every day. It's a daily exercise with your team to make them accountable and to make them understand what is the part that they own, right? And
Correct.
making sure that they actually own that from within.
Exactly. And then the final article that I picked was one that talked about whether it's a project manager, whether it's a coach or a scrum master, they're hired to do a particular job. But sometimes there's that perception that they're going to have lots of time on their hands. So why don't they do additional work? And many times, if the scrum master or the agile lead happens to have come from a engineering side, they are used to, let's say, developing code or testing, there's that temptation, let me just roll up my sleeves and start to help the team. And I think it's very important that part of accountability is understanding what is one's primary responsibility and taking ownership for that. That is what we are going to be measured on. And while we can certainly do other things to help the team, if we spend too much time doing those other things, we could end up neglecting that first role that we have, that primary role we have. I always use the analogy of an orchestra. The project manager, for example, is the conductor of the orchestra. Now, that project manager or that conductor, they might be an expert at playing the violin, but you're never going to see a conductor jump down from the podium into the string section and start to play the violin with the people that are in that section of the orchestra. It would never happen. And so what we need to understand is when we're in this sort of an agile leadership role, part of our accountability is to take that big picture, to sort of
Exactly.
keep our eye on the big picture and not get ourselves sucked into the weeds. That's what all of our team members are there for. We need to be there to support them.
Exactly. And it's funny how many times we actually heard that question, right? Even when I was working directly with projects, I always heard that question. So how many projects you can handle, right? How many projects you can handle more? And my answer was always like, okay, it depends. It depends on how much we enable the teams, how much we empower the teams to be able to self-manage. So, and it depends on the complexity of the project. So sometimes I will need to be more involved in a project if we cannot enable the team to go to that level. But my role here is much more about empowerment and enablement than within the project itself, right?
Absolutely. And if you dilute ownership too much, so if you make a project manager or a lead responsible for one initiative, then they are 100% accountable for the success of that. The moment you start to give them 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 initiatives to work with, now you're diluting that accountability and their ability to step up and actually achieve what they've taken ownership for, it's not really going to be there. And
Exactly.
unfortunately, I mean, as we get further in our careers, we get better at being able to judge how many projects of different levels of complexity can we take on at a time. But early in their careers, many project managers are very eager to
To show
succeed.
work.
They want to show their worth. And
Yeah.
so they'll say, yeah, sure, send more projects my way. And yet that's the surest path to failure.
Exactly. We also done that before, right?
Absolutely. This is where, I mean,
This
as
is where
much
we
as
learn it.
as much as you want to learn by reading good books, by taking courses, by hearing from mentors, many times we learn through the school of hard knocks that way by making mistakes.
Exactly. Exactly. That's great. That's great.